They said her lungs would give out before the bluebells came up. An earl needed a name on a marriage register and a heartbeat behind it long enough to satisfy a dead man's will, and so he found Lydia Pembrook in a solicitor's cold anteroom and put his ring on her finger in a vestry not much larger than a closet, and had her on a coach bound north before the ink was properly dry. Every person of any standing in 3 counties expected her in the churchyard before midsummer. The Earl of Dunmore expected it most of all, and had designed his arrangements around the likelihood with the efficiency of a man who cannot afford to grieve what he never intended to keep. What none of them thought to reckon on was that Lydia Pembrook left on a Yorkshire moor in November with a failing chest and a purse full of someone else's conscience money, had absolutely no intention of dying to anyone's convenience. The church was small and smelled of cold stone and tallow, and the vicar read the service the way men read legal notices, fast, without inflection, without lifting his eyes. Lydia held to the carved end of the pew because she needed something solid. Her father, Judge Silas Pembrook, had died the previous spring and left behind a library of legal texts and a daughter with scarred lung tissue and no prospects that anyone could afford. The solicitor's letter had come in September. The Earl of Dunmore's late father had written into the entail a condition. His son and heir must be married before his 30th birthday, or the greater part of the estate passed to a cousin. The old Earl had kept at arm's length for 30 years and despised for 31. The solicitor had described it as a matter of business. Lydia had understood from those 3 words exactly what she was being purchased for and exactly how long she was expected to remain useful. She had signed anyway. A woman written off as a foregone conclusion might as well be written off with a title as without one. Hugh Calder, Earl of Dunmore, stood beside her in unrelieved dark wool and spoke his vows with the flat precision of a man reading figures from a column. He did not look at her once. He had a well-made face and the kind of stillness that looks like composure until you notice it for what it actually is. Something held down by force of will that doesn't want to stay down. When the vicar asked for the ring, he produced it and slid it over Lydia's knuckle without ceremony. It was too large. She closed her fist to keep it on. She felt the room tip gently at its edges, the familiar warning her body gave when she had spent more of herself than she had to spend. She pressed her shoulder to the pew and waited for the world to right itself and did not let her face change. The vicar's glance moved to her and away. She knew that look. It was the same look the solicitor had given her, and the doctor before that, and the landlady when she'd fallen behind on rent. The look of a person running a private calculation about how much longer they needed to concern themselves with you. Not long, they all concluded, and went back to their business. The carriage that afternoon was well sprung, and the road was bad, and neither of them spoke. Hugh sat across from her with a book that he did not turn a single page of, and looked out the window at a landscape that grew wilder and more bare with every mile north. Lydia tried once, some small remark about the weather coming in off the dales, and he answered in 4 words without turning his head. She did not try again. She was too tired, and she had learned a long time ago, in the quiet rooms of her father's house, to make better use of silence than other people did. So she watched him instead. She noticed it as the light was going, when the driver took a track that wound past the burned shell of an old farm building on the eastern margin of the estate. Just a ruin, charred stone, a collapsed roof, no great matter. But Hugh's hand, resting on his knee, closed slowly into a fist. The book fell to the seat beside him. His gaze went to the far wall of the carriage and stayed there, fixed on nothing, jaw set, for the full 1/4 mile until the ruin was out of sight. He said nothing, did not explain, and Lydia stored the fact away in the careful back room of her mind, where she kept things she didn't yet understand but knew would matter. Dunmore Hall appeared out of the dusk like something the moor had grown and then abandoned. A long, low stone pile of a place, older than it looked, with a west wing that had clearly given up fighting the weather some years prior, slates gone in jagged patches, ivy pulling at the mortar, a chimney standing without its stack. It sat in the last grey light with its face to the moor and its back to nothing in particular, and a wind coming across the open ground had been at it for a very long time and intended to keep on. A woman came out to meet them with a lantern, broad-shouldered and weathered, her hands already rough with cold, and something older than cold. Tench, the housekeeper, the whole of Dunmore's remaining household, it turned out, along with an elderly groundskeeper named Walt Briggs, and a girl up from the village who came 3 days a week. Mrs. Tench looked at Hugh with practiced deference, and looked at Lydia with something Lydia recognised as the same calculation the vicar had run, and came to the same answer, and put it somewhere behind her face. Hugh would not come inside. He stood in the swept-bare forecourt and gave his instructions in a level, carrying voice. The Countess was to be kept comfortable. The household account came quarterly from his London solicitor. A doctor 3 miles off in the market town had been retained. He said the word Countess each time, as if reading it in a foreign language. Then he drew a leather purse from inside his coat and held it out, and for the first time since the vestry he looked directly at Lydia. One look, she couldn't name what was in it then. She only knew it was not nothing, and that whatever it was, it cost him. "This will keep the house through spring," he said. "You won't be troubled by me." "No," Lydia said, and held his gaze until he was the one to turn away. "I don't imagine that I shall." Something moved behind his eyes. Then he gave the purse to Mrs. Tench, walked to his horse, and mounted, and rode back down the track without once looking at the burned ruin as he passed it. She watched him go until the dark had him entirely. That night, she stood at the window of the great cold master bedroom with 3 shawls around her shoulders and looked out at the moors, flat and enormous and very black, and waited to feel the despair that seemed appropriate to her situation. What came instead, rising beneath the exhaustion and the ache in her chest, was something she recognised after a while as pure, clear anger. Every last person who had touched her life this year had looked at her and seen an ending, a closed account, a foregone conclusion. Her father's creditors, the solicitor, the vicar, Hugh Calder, all of them counting down. "Well," she said to the dark, and her voice was thin but her words weren't. "We'll see about that." She nearly died all the same. She never pretended otherwise in the years that followed, and Lydia Pembrook was not a woman built for flattering herself. The November cold came off the moor like something personal, and it got into her chest within the first week, and it did not come back out again for 6 of the worst weeks of her life. She kept only fragments of that time, the water-stained ceiling above her narrow bed, Mrs. Tench's rough hands turning her in the sheets, the moor wind coming through every gap in the west wing walls, and Walt Briggs appearing once at the bedroom door with a bundle of dried thyme from somewhere, setting it on the sill without a word, and going away again. She woke one January morning wrung out and light as paper and discovered, with something close to surprise, that she was still breathing. Mrs. Tench was asleep upright in the hard chair beside her, chin dropped to her chest, grey shadows under her eyes that had not been there in November. Lydia lay looking at her for a long time, understanding what those shadows cost and what they meant. She had not earned them. She had not yet done a single thing to earn them. "You stayed," she said when the housekeeper woke. Mrs. Tench straightened with a wince and rubbed her face with both hands and looked at Lydia with the frank, assessing eye of a woman who has long since finished with sentimentality. "I don't make a habit," she said, "of letting what's given to my care go without a fight." Then she went to get broth, because she was not a woman built for extended tenderness, and she had already given more than she normally allowed herself. That was the beginning of everything. Lydia never forgot it, and never stopped trying to deserve it. She spent 2 months getting her strength back, and she came to terms early. And without self-pity with the fact that she would never get all of it. She would always be a woman who had to sit down halfway up a flight of stairs. Her lungs would always mark the weather before the barometer did. Cold air in quantity was a negotiation, not a given. She understood the terms and she accepted them, and did not waste further energy wishing them different, because wishing was expensive and she had other things to spend on. The first thing she did when she could walk the length of the upper hall was move herself bodily out of the master wing. It was actively trying to kill her. Enormous rooms with ceilings that ate the heat, windows that admitted the draught, with something like enthusiasm, and fireplaces that seemed to draw the cold down rather than the smoke up. She took instead the small room off the back kitchen, where the iron range burned day and night, and the thick flagstone floor held the warmth of it long past midnight. She had her bed brought down and set up beside the door to the passage, and she settled herself in like a seed in the only good soil. Mrs. Tench said it was beneath the dignity of a countess. Lydia said a breathing commoner in a warm room was worth considerably more to the world than a titled corpse in a cold one. Mrs. Tench considered this for a moment, and produced a short bark of a laugh that cracked the wall between them like a stone through ice. And that was that. Then she read the accounts. Her father had taught her to read an estate ledger the way other fathers taught their daughters to read music. As a matter of course, because it was useful, and because Judge Silas Pembrook had believed that a woman without practical knowledge was a woman left to the mercy of practical men, and he had not trusted practical men. It took Lydia 3 evenings by the range with the books open in her lap to see plainly that Dunmore Hall was being robbed. Not dramatically. There was not much here worth a grand theft, but steadily, and from several directions at once, a wool factor billing for twice the fleece that ever left the property, a tenant farmer appearing faithfully in the rent rolls who had died, by Walt's quiet accounting, the winter before last, and a quarterly payment going out under the heading of moorland drainage consultation to a man none of them had ever seen on the property, and who Walt confirmed did not, in Walt's estimation, exist. Lydia closed each arrangement with letters so legally precise and so courteously implacable that not one of the men who received them dared to respond in anything other than silence. Within 6 months, the same modest quarterly allowance went half again as far. Walt Briggs was 63, and had worked Dunmore's land since he was 20, and had watched it decline around him with the flat resignation of a man who has been given too many instructions that led nowhere to believe very firmly in instructions any more. He did what he was asked, and very little else, not out of laziness but out of a long-trained certainty that effort poured into this particular ground came to nothing. Lydia did not give him instructions. She walked out to wherever he was working, slow, careful walks, the kind her lungs would allow, and she asked him things. What had grown in the kitchen garden 10 years ago? Where the wind came hard across the upper moor and where the ground lay sheltered? Which of the tumble-down outbuildings were sound under their neglect? He answered shortly at first, watching sideways for mockery, and found none because there was none. She carried his answers back and thought about them overnight, and came out the next morning, having clearly turned them over, and she asked more. By February, Walt Briggs was giving her unsolicited opinions for the first time in a decade, because she was the first person in a decade who had seemed to find the information worth having. Together, that spring, they closed the west wing entirely. There was no saving it without money neither of them possessed, and every winter storm pulled more of it loose and drove moisture into the sound part of the house behind it. Walt boarded the connecting doors and stripped the wing of everything useful. They gave the rest of it to the moor, and with that one clean decision, Dunmore Hall became, for the first time in years, a house that could reasonably be kept warm and dry. The kitchen garden was Lydia's own particular project, and she loved it with a practicality that surprised even her. She had learned herbs from her father's housekeeper, which ones treated fever, which drew out infection, which dried well and kept their strength through a northern winter. She could not do the heavy digging herself, so she planned it on paper by lamplight, and hired 2 boys up from the village with the freed-up money from the accounts, and she sat on a low stool against the warm south wall, and directed and pruned and annotated and thought, and in this found a steadiness she had not known since her father's house. By the 2nd spring, the garden fed the house and had surplus besides. By the 3rd season, Lydia had a working arrangement with the apothecary in the market town, who came out with a cart on Tuesdays and left coin behind him, because properly dried valerian root and clean boneset and lavender in any reliable quantity were things he had always before been obliged to send 40 miles for, and now did not. The boundary matter came to a head in the first autumn. A landowner to the south named Aldous Crabbe had been pushing his sheep onto Dunmore's upper moor, grazing land for 2 seasons, slowly and carefully, a little more each time, the way men like Crabbe worked, not grabbing but leaning, banking on the assumption that a hall with no lord in residence and a countess who was, by all reliable report, either already dead or near enough to make no difference, would not notice and would not resist. He had produced a document he claimed established his right to the disputed acres. He produced it in the market town. He told people about it at the inn. Lydia had read that document. She had read it 3 times, because she wanted to be certain before she acted, and Judge Pembrook had taught her that certainty was worth the time it cost. The survey date was impossible. It cited a boundary marker that Walt confirmed had been pulled down and reset 15 years prior, before the date on the document. 2 of the 3 named witnesses had died, which was convenient, but the third, a retired solicitor's clerk now living in Harrogate, would never have signed anything so sloppily drawn. She knew that without needing to ask, because her father had known the man. She sent the clerk a letter. He confirmed the forgery in writing within a fortnight. When Crabbe's men came onto the upper moor in October to pull the boundary stones, Lydia was already there, standing in the wind with the original Dunmore deed in one hand and her own written summary of the relevant statutes in the other, reading the specific provision aloud in a voice that carried well past the men and into the heather. The men stopped, looked at each other, had not, evidently, been prepared for this. Hugh had come back to Dunmore Hall 3 days prior. He had ridden up the track expecting silence and boards across the windows and possibly a fresh mound in the churchyard. He had found instead a gate that swung true on new-cast hinges, smoke from 4 chimneys, and Mrs. Tench dropping him a curtsy in the dooryard with an expression that contained no warmth and considerable appraisal. And then from inside the house, a voice saying clearly, "Let him come in, Mrs. Tench. He has ridden a long way to see a grave. The least we can do is show him there is nothing here left to bury." She had come out into the low grey light of the afternoon, and he had not known her. The woman who had stood beside him in that cold vestry had been grey-faced and fragile, all her effort bent to the single labour of remaining upright. The woman who came out to meet him now was slight still, careful in the way she moved, carrying herself with the precise economy of a person who understood her body's limits exactly and kept within them. But she stood straight, and her eyes came up to his, and took their measure with no trace of anxiety in them whatsoever, and her hands were the hands of a woman who worked, and she had about her an authority so complete and settled that it filled that forecourt more thoroughly than his title had ever filled a room in London. She wore a plain working dress and a shawl, and at her collarbone, on a cord wound with a length of plain thread, hung the ring he had put on her finger in that cold vestry 2 years prior. "Your lordship," Lydia said, "you'll forgive the state of things. We had no word you were coming, and I'm afraid we're not set up to receive. Had you only sent ahead that you were coming to collect the keys, I'd have had them waiting." He had nothing to say. He, who had run 3 estates and a seat in Parliament, and the whole cold apparatus of an ancient name, stood in the swept forecourt of the ruin he had abandoned, and could not locate a single word. She let him stand there, did not rescue him. Dinner that night was taken in the small warm parlour that had once been a servants' hall. At a mismatched table laid with food that was simple and very good, every scrap of it grown or caught within 2 miles of where they sat. Lydia addressed him with the precise courtesy one uses for a solicitor come about a lease. Over the course of that meal she laid before him, in a level and unhurried voice, a complete accounting of what had been made of his estate and his allowance and his name. It was accurate and unanswerable, and he made no attempt to answer any of it. He put the offer of money on the desk before her on the 3rd morning, a sum that would have re-roofed the west wing and replaced every window in the hall. He said it was nothing to him. "I know it isn't," she said. She didn't touch the paper. "That's rather the problem. If I take your money, then this is your house that I've mended in your absence, and I am after all only a wife set here to keep the place tidy, until it suited you to remember it existed." She pushed the folded draft back across the desk with one finger. "If you want to be useful to Dunmore Hall, Walt will show you where the field wall wants rebuilding on the north boundary. He's been asking for another pair of hands since March." Hugh looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the draft back into his coat and said, "All right." And the next morning, before full light, he found Walt in the yard and asked about the wall. He watched her face down Crabbe's men from 20 yards back, standing in the field gateway with his hands in his coat pockets. And he did not move or speak. She didn't need him. That was the thing he was only beginning to understand. She had not needed anyone for 2 solid years, because needing had always cost her more than it returned. And she had long since organized her life around the assumption that need was a debt that never got paid. He went inside that evening and wrote Aldous Crabbe a letter. A short one. He knew enough about Crabbe's finances, in the way that men of his position come to know the vulnerabilities of their neighbours, to understand exactly where to apply pressure. He mentioned 3 specific irregularities in the document Crabbe had been circulating. He noted that he had recently been in correspondence with his own solicitor regarding the use of a retired clerk's forged signature, a matter that the clerk in question, having confirmed the forgery in writing, was apparently prepared to bring before the assizes. He trusted this small misunderstanding about the Upper Moor could be resolved without further trouble. He sent it by fast rider and told no one. Crabbe's men were gone from the Upper Moor before noon the following day. A villager told Lydia, 2 mornings later, that there was word Dunmore's Earl had sent a letter that had sorted the whole business without a word spoken aloud. She came back up the track and found Hugh in the yard replacing the latch on the kitchen garden gate, not looking up from it. "That was you," she said, "not a question." "You had already done everything that mattered," he said. "I only made the legal geography a little more inconvenient for him." A pause. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to be a thing you owed me. You've spent 2 years owing nobody anything. That seemed worth protecting." She stood looking at him for a long while. Something in the set of her shoulders changed. Something she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing the weight of it, shifting almost imperceptibly. She nodded once, went inside. That evening at dinner she spoke to him for the first time, not as a factor, but as a person who was actually in the room. The storm came down in the dead middle of February, a hard southwesterly that had been building since noon. It came in off the moor fast, and the lightning with it. And around 2 in the morning a strike hit the old granary that adjoined the hall's east end. Not a full fire. The cold and wet saw to that, but sparks enough, and the dry timbers in the granary loft caught, and there was smoke coming through the connecting door before anyone was properly awake. Lydia was already in there. Hugh heard her from the yard. She had gone in, after the deed box, the ledgers, the estate papers she kept in the locked chest on the granary's ground floor, because 2 years of work was in those papers, and she was, this was entirely characteristic of her, more concerned about losing the records than about the smoke. He stood at the granary door and could not move. The smell of it went straight through 11 years and took him back to a different night and a different building and a different sound from inside, and for a moment he was 20 years old again, and the smoke was black-green, and his sister's voice had just gone quiet, in a way it never went quiet, and his hand on the door frame was shaking. Then he heard Lydia cough. He went in. He came out with her under one arm and the deed box under the other, and they fell into the snow-covered yard, and he couldn't stop shaking, not from the cold, and she was breathing badly. Her lungs did not forgive smoke. He would learn that more completely in the weeks that followed, but she was breathing. He carried her to the kitchen and set her by the range that was always burning, and sat on the stone floor beside her, and held her hand and did not let go. She woke near dawn, and the first thing her eyes found in the low light was him, still on the floor, still holding fast to her hand. "You went into a burning building," she said. "Yes." "You don't go near fires." She had seen it months ago, the way he sat back from the hearth, the way he let others light the candles, the way he had paused, just a breath too long at the granary door, before helping Walt move stored peat. She had filed it away and said nothing. "No," he said, "I don't." And then, because it was the dead of the night, and the deed box was safe on the kitchen table, and his defences were somewhere out in the February dark, and he had just walked into the thing he had spent 11 years on the far side of England avoiding, he told her, his sister, Frances, younger than him by 3 years, the outbuilding fire when he was 20, summer a dry July, a lantern knocked over in the stable loft, He had been in the east yard. He had gotten to the door, and the beam had come down on the wrong side of him, and the smoke had already. He had been not 40 feet from her. He had heard her, and then he had not heard her, and then the men from the village had come, and it was too late. It had already been too late, and he had known it before they told him. "I married you and sent you to the one estate I could never bring myself to return to," he said, "because I knew with certainty that if I sent you here, I would never have cause to come." He looked at the floor. "I arranged everything so that I would never have to come back, including you." Lydia was quiet for a long time. The range ticked. Outside, the storm was finally spending itself. "You came in anyway," she said at last. "Tonight, you didn't stop." "No." "You couldn't." "No," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I'm telling you." She drew his head down against her, this woman who had rebuilt a dying estate with property law and dried herbs and sheer refusal to cooperate with other people's expectations of her. And she held him, and after a long while he stopped holding himself together and let something go that had been locked and silent for 11 years. Not loudly, almost without sound, but he wept and she let him, and did not say any of the useless things that people say in those moments. And just before dawn the storm finished itself and went east, and the moors were very still. He did not leave. He stayed through the winters last weeks, and through the whole of the spring and summer that followed, and each morning that he did not leave was one more stone in a structure that Lydia had spent 2 years, telling herself could never be built between them. He learned to work, not gracefully at first. His hands had spent their lives in silk-lined gloves, and Walt's opinions of him in those early weeks were expressed entirely through pointed silences, but with a stubborn tirelessness that was, Lydia came to see, the same quality that had kept him upright through 11 years of grief. He did not do things halfway. He only needed something worth the whole of him. He set the upper moor boundary stones with Walt through March and April, until the two of them reached something that was not yet friendship, but had the bones of it. He learned the herb garden from the wrong end of a trowel, and was corrected by Lydia without ceremony whenever he got it wrong. He learned the accounts, not to take them over, that she made clear, but to understand what she had built, and to be able to stand in for her when her lungs had a bad week, which they always eventually would. By summer they were talking easily. By the end of summer they were sitting on the low stone wall of the kitchen garden in the evenings, and one night Hugh reached across and filled her cup before his own, and then left his hand over hers where it rested on the warm stone, and she turned her hand beneath his and did not take it back. The rider from London came in early October in the King's own livery, mud to the saddle, carrying a sealed letter he would give to no one but the Earl of Dunmore. Hugh opened it in the yard, and Lydia watched from the kitchen doorway, and she saw his face go still in the way she had learnt to read as the expression he wore when confronted with something he did not know how to want. It was Parliament, a committee, a seat that wanted filling. The letter was courteous and expected compliance, and was not between its lines truly a request. He came to find her in the kitchen garden. She was already setting down her trowel. Her back was to him. "You should go," she said. She said it to the seedlings. "It's what you were bred for. A great name needs rooms to fill. I've understood from the beginning that you'd go when the moment came." Her voice was level and even and exactly right in its evenness, and that was the thing that undid him, that evenness, because he knew what it had cost her to build it and how long she had needed it, and what it meant that she was using it now. "We'll manage here, we always have." She started to rise. He took her wrist in his hand gently and held her there. She went still. "Look at me," he said. "There's nothing to look at," she said. "You're leaving. I've grown very tired, Hugh, of standing in this yard watching men ride down that track, and I'd take it as a kindness if you would simply go quickly and spare me the watching of it." He came around in front of her. He made himself be seen. She looked at him, and her eyes were dry, and the dryness was worse than anything else could have been, because in it he could read everything that had gone into making her what she was. 2 years alone on a moor, and before that a childhood spent being the daughter no one could afford to keep, and a father she'd loved, who had left her anyway, in the one way no one could be blamed for, and now this, which was the same thing wearing a different face. So he did the only thing that could possibly answer it. He went inside. He did it in front of Mrs. Tench and Walt and Becca, the kitchen girl, and he went to the iron range, the one that had burned every day and every night for 2 winters without being let out, the warm centre of everything Lydia had rebuilt from ruin. And he opened the iron door, and he put the letter from London into the fire and watched it take. He kept his eyes on it until it was ash. "There," he said. His voice wasn't quite steady. "It's answered. I'm not going back. Not for Parliament, not for London, not for anything they care to send me." He turned to her. "I rode north expecting to close an estate and found instead the only living thing I have ever been in a position to deserve. You made something real here out of what I gave you, which was ruins and a name on a register and an allowance that should have been 3 times the size. I'm not asking you to forgive me for the ruins. I don't think that's forgivable, and I won't insult you by asking it. I'm asking only to be allowed to stay in what you built, to be allowed to earn it." He looked at her hands, those work-roughened, careful hands, and then at her face. "Let me stay, Lydia. Let me stay." Her dry eyes filled, one tear, then another, and then she took a fistful of his shirt in her hand, her brown and careful hand, and held on. "You are 2 winters and a very long spring late, Hugh Calder." "I know exactly how late I am," he said. "I intend to spend every morning of it making that up to you if you'll allow me the time." "No," she said, and then, with something in her voice that was very close to a laugh and clearly surprised her, "I don't imagine you'll be going anywhere." He gathered her in, and she let herself be held, unhurried and complete, and without any fear in it, while the last of the summons went to fine grey ash in the range, and the moors outside lay still and gold in the late October light. He stayed. He never went back to London. The men there were displeased and made their displeasure known through several channels over several months, and then found someone else for the committee, and were displeased about other things, as men in London reliably are, and Dunmore Hall did not particularly notice. He worked. He worked badly at first, and then well, the way he did everything once he had decided it was worth doing. His hands hardened, his back found new uses. Walt, by the second spring, had taken to asking his opinion on the moorland drainage with the easy directness of a man who has concluded that another man's judgment is worth the consulting. The fire in the range, he learned to tend it himself that winter. He did it one morning without announcement. Lydia saw him. Neither of them said anything about it. She went back to her letters. He went back to the coal scuttle. But she knew, and he knew she knew, and between 2 people who had learned to speak most clearly in the absence of words, that was more than enough. 2 people broken in different places, each broken in the particular way that the other was whole, finding their way to something that was not grand and not simple, and not anything that anyone else had designed for either of them. The strongest houses are not the ones that come down by inheritance, whole and furnished and already warm. They are the ones rebuilt stone by patient stone out of the places where things were meant to end, kept warm through every black winter by fires that are never let go out, and tended, every ordinary morning, by 2 people who came the long hard way around to understanding that a home is not a thing you are given, or commanded, or entitled to, but a thing you build together with your own hands and choose and keep choosing, every day that you do not ride away.